Darnell Vance stood over the operating table, his hands steady under the bright lights. He was the city's top surgeon, a man who had everything. But a frantic call from the ER changed his morning. A homeless woman had collapsed near the hospital's loading dock. Darnell rushed down, expecting a routine emergency. He knelt beside the frail, dirt-stained figure. As he checked her pulse, her thin fingers suddenly gripped his wrist. She gasped a single word, "Junior." Darnell froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. Only one person in the world had ever called him that. He looked at her weathered face and saw a small, star-shaped scar on her palm. It was the exact mark from a fire 20 years ago. The fire that was supposed to have killed his mother. Darnell's breath hitched as he stared at the woman everyone else had called a nuisance. He realized the grave he visited every year might be empty. Who was the woman he buried? And why was his mother alive, begging for scraps at his own hospital? Darnell stepped back, his boots squeaking against the sterile linoleum floor. The word "Junior" echoed in his ears, louder than the beeping heart monitors. It was a private name, a secret shared only between a little boy and his mother in a small house that no longer existed. He looked at the medical staff standing around. They saw a nameless beggar. They saw a burden on the hospital's budget. But Darnell saw the way her thumb brushed against his skin. It was a rhythmic, soothing motion he remembered from 1,000 nights before the fire. He quickly pulled his hand away as if burned. His mind raced back to that night 20 years ago, the smoke, the screams, the closed casket he had wept over for days. He had spent a fortune on a marble headstone every year. He placed yellow roses on a plot of land in Oakwood Cemetery. If this woman was real, then who was resting under that stone? Darnell looked at the woman's tattered coat. A small, plastic-wrapped bundle fell from her pocket. It hit the floor with a dull thud. Before a nurse could grab it, Darnell snatched it up. Inside the plastic was a folded piece of yellowed paper. It wasn't a note. It was a drawing, a crude, child's sketch of a bookstore with a blue door. His breath stopped. His father had owned that bookstore. It had burned to the ground along with their home. No photos of it survived. Not a single one. Darnell felt a cold chill wash over him. This woman didn't just know his name. She carried a map to a past that was supposed to be ash. He looked up and saw Reginald Moore standing at the ER entrance. Reginald was the hospital's chairman and Darnell's longtime mentor. He was the man who had helped Darnell rebuild his life after the fire. Reginald wasn't smiling. He was staring at the homeless woman with an expression that wasn't pity. It was something sharper, something that looked like terror. Reginald caught Darnell's eye and walked toward him, his footsteps heavy and hurried. He didn't ask about the woman's health. Instead, he reached for the plastic bundle in Darnell's hand. Darnell instinctively stepped back, hiding the drawing behind his back. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. Why was the most powerful man in the city looking at a dying beggar as if she were a ghost come to haunt him? Reginald Moore's expensive silk tie flickered under the fluorescent lights as he lunged for the small bundle. His fingers missed by an inch. Darnell stuffed the plastic-wrapped drawing into his lab coat pocket, his jaw tight. Reginald stopped, smoothing his suit jacket with trembling hands around them. The ER was a whirlwind of high-end medicine. Doctors in crisp uniforms operated million-dollar machines. Outside the window, Darnell's customized Mercedes sat glinting in the sun. Everything in this room screamed power and success. Then there was the woman on the gurney. She was a stain on the perfection. Her skin was gray, covered in layers of street grime. Her fingernails were broken and black with dirt. A nurse reached out with a pair of scissors to cut away the woman's tattered sleeve. But she stopped, wrinkling her nose in disgust. She looked at Darnell, silently asking why they were wasting a private suite on a body that smelled of the gutters. Reginald's voice was a low, urgent hiss. He ignored the woman entirely. He told Darnell to think about his reputation. He reminded him that the hospital's donors were arriving in an hour for a gala. Reginald pointed at the exit and said a city shelter could handle people like her. He called her a distraction. He called her a liability. He didn't look at her face once. He spoke as if she were already dead. Darnell didn't move. He looked from the diamond cufflinks on Reginald's wrists to the bare, swollen feet of the beggar. The contrast was a physical weight in the room. He remembered Reginald standing by the grave 20 years ago, telling him it was time to let the past burn. Darnell reached for a basin of warm water and a clean sponge. The head nurse tried to take it from him, saying a senior surgeon shouldn't do menial work. Darnell pushed her hand aside. He began to wipe the dirt from the woman's forearm. The grime came away in dark streaks. As the skin became clear, Darnell's heart skipped. Just below her elbow was a jagged, star-shaped scar. It was a burn mark. A very old one. He knew that mark. He had seen his mother get it when a hot iron fell in their kitchen when he was 5. But then he noticed something else. Next to the scar were 3 small, faded letters tattooed into the skin. They weren't a name. They were a set of numbers, a date. It was Darnell's birthday. Reginald saw the tattoo and his face went bone white. He didn't stay to argue. He turned and walked out of the ER, nearly knocking over a tray of instruments. Darnell watched him go, then looked back at the woman. Why would a homeless beggar have his birthday tattooed on her arm? And why did his mentor look like he wanted to kill her? Darnell's hand shook as he dropped the sponge back into the basin. The water turned a muddy brown, but his eyes were locked on those 3 small numbers. His birthday. It wasn't just a date. It was the only secret he had never told Reginald. The silence in the room became heavy. The beeping of the heart monitor felt like a countdown. He leaned closer to the woman's face. Now that the grime was gone, he saw the curve of her jaw. He saw the way her eyelashes flickered as she struggled to breathe. This wasn't just a stranger. Every line on her face felt like a map leading him home. Darnell reached out and gently brushed a strand of damp, silver hair away from her forehead. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open. They were deep brown, clouded with pain, but sharp with a sudden recognition. She didn't look at the expensive equipment. She didn't look at the doctors. She looked straight into Darnell's soul. Her dry, cracked lips moved. No sound came out at first. Then, she reached out with a trembling hand and touched the golden stethoscope around Darnell's neck. "Little lion," she whispered. The voice was thin, like paper tearing, but the words hit Darnell like a physical blow. That was his mother's private name for him, a name she only used when the world felt too big for a small boy. Darnell's knees hit the cold floor. He didn't care about his white coat getting stained. He didn't care about the staff watching him in shock. He grabbed her hand, feeling the rough, calloused skin against his own. "Mom," he choked out. The woman's grip tightened for a split second, a desperate strength surging through her frail body. She tried to pull him closer, but her monitor began to flatline. The steady beep turned into a sharp, continuous scream. Nurses rushed forward, pushing Darnell aside. He stood there paralyzed, watching the woman who had just called his name slip back into the darkness. If she was alive, then whose body had he buried 20 years ago? And why did Reginald Moore look like he had seen a ghost? The truth about Darnell's past is unraveling right before his eyes. If you believe a son's love can uncover even the darkest secrets, please like and subscribe to see if Darnell can save his mother in time. Where are you watching this story from? Florida, South Africa, or maybe Jamaica? Let us know in the comments. The crash cart slammed against the gurney, jolting Darnell out of his shock. Medical staff swarmed the bed, their voices sharp and clinical. "Clear," the lead nurse shouted, pressing the paddles to the woman's frail chest. Darnell felt a hand grab his shoulder and yank him backward. He stumbled, his polished shoes slipping on the wet floor. It was Reginald. His face was a mask of forced calm, but his eyes were darting toward the hallway. "Darnell, get out of here," Reginald hissed. "You're too close to this. Let the team do their jobs." Darnell didn't move. He stared at the flat line on the monitor. His mother's hand had gone limp, dropping away from his white coat. The name Little Lion was still burning in his mind. He looked at Reginald and saw him signal to two security guards by the door. They stepped forward, their hands resting on their belts. Darnell's chest felt like it was full of hot lead. He pushed Reginald's hand off his shoulder. "That's my mother," he whispered. His voice was raw. Reginald didn't even flinch. He shook his head and said Darnell was exhausted. He said the trauma of the fire was playing tricks on his mind. He called it a hallucination. Darnell lunged for the woman's tattered bag on the side table. He needed proof. He needed to show them the drawing. But the bag was gone. He looked around the room, his eyes frantic. It had been there a minute ago. He saw a young janitor quickly pushing a trash bin out of the room. Reginald stepped in front of Darnell, blocking his path. "Darnell, listen to me," Reginald said, his voice dropping to a smooth, fatherly tone. "Your mother died 20 years ago. I was the one who identified the body. I was the one who held you at the funeral. This woman is just a sick beggar who heard some rumors." The monitor suddenly gave a weak, erratic beep. Her heart was beating again. But before Darnell could reach her, Reginald barked an order to the guards. They grabbed Darnell's arms, pulling him toward the exit. As they dragged him out, Darnell saw Reginald Lane over the woman's bed. He wasn't checking her pulse. He was whispering something into her ear. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, and she looked at Reginald with pure, unfiltered terror. If this woman was just a stranger, why was Reginald Moore trying so hard to erase her? And where had her belongings disappeared to in less than 60 seconds? The heavy double doors of the ER swung open, but Darnell wasn't being let back in. Instead, he was met by a wall of cameras and bright flashes. Reginald had orchestrated a scene. A group of wealthy board members and hospital donors stood in the hallway, their faces full of confusion and judgment. Among them was Vanessa, Darnell's fiancée, wearing a silk dress that cost more than a nurse's yearly salary. She rushed forward, but she didn't hug him. She looked at the muddy water stains on his white coat and the dirt under his fingernails. She stepped back, covering her mouth with a gloved hand. The whispers started immediately. People were murmuring about the brilliant doctor who had lost his mind over a homeless woman. Reginald stepped out behind Darnell, putting a firm hand on his shoulder. He addressed the crowd with a somber, pitying tone. He told them Darnell was suffering from a nervous breakdown. He mentioned the stress of the upcoming gala and the sad delusions of a man who missed his long-dead mother. Vanessa nodded quickly, telling the donors that Malik needed rest and professional help. Darnell felt the weight of their stares. It was like being suffocated by velvet. He tried to speak, to tell them about the Little Lion nickname, but Vanessa cut him off. She leaned in close, her perfume cloying and thick. She whispered that he was embarrassing their family name. She told him to go home and wash the street filth off before the board decided to revoke his license. Darnell looked past them, toward the janitor's closet at the end of the hall. He saw the young janitor from earlier. The boy was nervously looking around, clutching a small, plastic-wrapped bundle under his arm. It was the woman's bag. The janitor made eye contact with Darnell for a split second, then quickly ducked into a stairwell. Reginald noticed the look. He didn't say a word, but he signaled to the security guards again. One of them began to move toward the stairwell, his hand reaching for his radio. Reginald turned back to the donors, smiling smoothly as if the problem was already solved. Vanessa grabbed Darnell's arm, pulling him toward the VIP elevator, away from the truth. Darnell's mind was screaming. If his mother was really dead, why was Reginald Moore sending security to hunt down a bag of trash? And why was the person Darnell trusted most trying to silence him? Darnell pulled his arm away from Vanessa's grip. He didn't head for the elevator. He turned and ran toward the stairwell where the janitor had vanished. Behind him, he heard Reginald's voice booming. telling the crowd that the doctor was unstable. The sound of camera shutters followed him until the heavy steel door slammed shut. The stairwell was cold and smelled of old floor wax. Darnell raced down 2 flights, his lungs burning. He caught up to the young janitor on the landing of the 3rd floor. The boy froze, his back against the concrete wall. He was clutching the plastic-wrapped bundle to his chest like a shield. "Give it to me," Darnell demanded, his voice echoing in the narrow space. The boy shook his head. He whispered that Mr. Moore had paid him a week's wages just to throw it in the incinerator. Darnell reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of $100 bills. He didn't count them. He just thrust them at the boy. The janitor hesitated, then handed over the bundle and took the money, disappearing into the hallway. Darnell's hands trembled as he tore open the plastic. He ignored the smell of damp cloth and street grime. He searched for the drawing, but he found something else first, a small, leather-bound diary. Most of the pages were ruined by water, but one page was still legible. It wasn't his mother's handwriting. The script was sharp and aggressive. He read the date at the top. It was from the week after the fire 20 years ago. The entry spoke about a payment for silence and a transfer to the psychiatric wing. Darnell felt a surge of resentment. He looked at the signature at the bottom. It wasn't Reginald Moore's. It was his own father's. Darnell felt the world tilt. His father was supposed to be a hero who died trying to save his mother. But the diary suggested his father had paid to hide her away. Had his father traded his mother's life for the insurance money that built Darnell's medical empire? He clutched the diary, his knuckles turning white. He thought about the yellow roses he placed on the grave every year. If his father had orchestrated this, then the man he idolized was a monster. But as he turned the page, a small newspaper clipping fell out. It was a photo of a young Reginald Moore standing in front of the burned-out bookstore. He was holding the same leather-bound diary. Why did Reginald have his father's diary? And why was the most important page, the one with the final names, missing a clean, jagged tear at the bottom? Darnell stood in the cold stairwell, his fingers digging into the leather cover of the diary. The signature at the bottom of the page was unmistakable. It was his father's slanted, elegant handwriting. A payment for silence, the words felt like poison. He looked at the newspaper clipping of a young Reginald Moore. His mentor was holding this very book 20 years ago. Darnell's breathing became ragged. A dark thought took root in his mind. He believed his father had sold his mother to Reginald to secure their fortune. He thought the woman in the ER was a pawn in a game his father had started. Anger, hot and blinding, surged through him. He shoved the diary into his pocket and kicked the heavy steel door open. He marched back into the hospital, his eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the woman's room. He saw Reginald standing outside the door, talking to a lawyer. Reginald looked up, his expression shifting from worry to a forced thin smile. Darnell didn't wait for him to speak. He pushed past Reginald and burst into the room. The old woman was awake now. She looked fragile, her eyes wide as she watched Darnell approach. He didn't see the mother who had called him Little Lion anymore. He saw a reminder of his father's betrayal. Darnell grabbed the edge of her bed, his knuckles white. He asked her how much his father had paid her to stay away. He asked her if she enjoyed watching him mourn at an empty grave for 2 decades. The woman's lips trembled. She tried to reach for his hand, but Darnell flinched away. He called her a liar. Ang tabi letter 1E3, o bala m letter 1E90, k letter 1EBB, don k letter 1E6ch tin. He shouted that he wanted her out of his hospital and out of his life. He turned to the nurses and ordered them to process her discharge papers immediately. He told them to send her to the city's furthest shelter. The woman didn't cry. She just watched him with a look of profound sorrow. She slowly reached into the collar of her hospital gown. She pulled out a small, silver locket hanging on a dirty string. She tried to hand it to him, but Darnell knocked it out of her hand. The locket hit the floor and popped open. Darnell didn't look at it. He turned his back on her and walked out. But as he passed the doorway, he saw Reginald more quickly kneeling to pick up the locket. Reginald's hand was shaking so much he could barely grip the silver chain. Darnell stopped. If this was all a scam by his father, why was Reginald Moore looking at that locket as if his life depended on it? And why was there a second, identical locket already sitting in Reginald's own pocket? Darnell didn't wait for Reginald to explain the lockets. He ran. He ignored the voices calling his name and the confused stares of the hospital staff. His polished shoes felt heavy as he reached the parking lot. The cold air bit at his face, but it couldn't stop the fire burning in his chest. He threw himself into his car and drove toward the only place that made sense: Oakwood Cemetery. Rain began to pour, blurring the windshield. Darnell stepped out of his car and marched through the mud toward his mother's headstone. He looked at the marble surface. It was clean and expensive. He had spent 20 years honoring this piece of stone. Now, he felt like a fool. He grabbed a heavy iron vase from a nearby grave. With a scream of rage, he swung it against the marble. The stone cracked. He swung again and again until his hands bled. He fell to his knees in the mud, gasping for air. He pulled the diary from his pocket. It was soaked now, the ink blighting like old wounds. He realized he had just chased away the only person who could tell him the truth. He had chosen Reginald's lies over the woman who knew his private name. A shadow fell over him. Darnell looked up. It was Keisha, the young nurse who had been helping him. She was holding an old, dusty manila folder. She didn't look at the broken headstone. She looked at Darnell with eyes full of pity. "You shouldn't have sent her away, doctor," she whispered. Darnell stood up, wiping the mud from his face. He asked her why she was following him. Keisha didn't answer. Instead, she opened the folder and handed him a single photograph. It was a Polaroid from 20 years ago. It showed the bookstore before the fire. In the window, his father was laughing. But in the background, standing in the shadows of the alley, was a man holding a gasoline can. Darnell squinted at the blurry figure. The man was wearing a very specific ring, a heavy gold band with a crest. Darnell's heart stopped. He looked at his own hand. He was wearing a replica of that same ring, a gift from Reginald Moore on his graduation day. Keisha reached into the folder again and pulled out a hospital discharge paper. It wasn't for the old woman. It was a death certificate from 20 years ago. The cause of death wasn't fire. It was listed as a forced sedative overdose. Darnell's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from the hospital security. The city shelter had just called. The old woman had never arrived. Her transport van had been found empty in a deserted alleyway. Darnell looked at the Polaroid, then at the empty grave. If Reginald didn't kill her 20 years ago, where was he taking her now? Darnell stared at the gold crest on his own finger. The metal felt like a hot iron searing his skin. He looked back at the blurry figure in the Polaroid. The man with the gas can. The man with the same ring. It wasn't his father. It was Reginald. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Reginald hadn't saved him from the fire. Reginald had started it. He grabbed the manila folder from Keisha's hands. He flipped through the pages with frantic movements. Behind the fake death certificate was a series of monthly bank transfers. They were dated every month for the last 20 years. The money went from the hospital's charity fund to a private asylum in the mountains. The asylum's owner was a shell company registered to Reginald Moore. Darnell's breath came in ragged gasps. Reginald hadn't buried his mother. He had incarcerated her. He had stolen her life, her name, and her sanity. And he had used Darnell's father's forged signature to make it look like a betrayal. Reginald hadn't just taken Darnell in, he had groomed him. He had turned the son into a loyal soldier for the man who destroyed his family. Keisha stepped closer, her voice trembling. She told Darnell that she had seen Reginald's personal driver heading toward the old incinerator plant on the edge of town. She saw them loading a frail figure into a black sedan, not a transport van. Darnell didn't say a word. He sprinted back to his car, tires screeching as he tore out of the cemetery. He drove with a blind, desperate speed. His hands were white on the steering wheel. He realized why Reginald had whispered in the woman's ear. He wasn't comforting her. He was threatening her one last time before finishing what he started 20 years ago. He reached the old incinerator plant. The iron gates were bent and rusted. In the center of the yard, a black sedan was idling. Smoke was already rising from the main chimney. Darnell jumped out of his car before it even stopped moving. He saw Reginald standing by the heavy steel doors of the furnace. Reginald was holding a small, silver locket. He looked up as Darnell approached. He didn't look afraid. He looked exhausted. Reginald reached for a lever on the wall and pulled it. The roar of the furnace grew louder, but then Darnell heard a muffled scream coming from inside a heavy wooden crate sitting on the conveyor belt. Darnell lunged forward, but Reginald stepped in his path. He held out a hand, showing Darnell a final document. It was a life insurance policy, one that was still active. And Darnell was the one who had been signing the renewal papers for years without ever looking at the name on the bottom line. Who had Darnell been unknowingly paying to keep dead? Darnell looked at the document in Reginald's hand. His own signature stared back at him, neat and professional. It was a life insurance policy for Cora Vance, the policy he had renewed every year for a decade. Reginald had told him it was a scholarship fund for underprivileged children. Darnell felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't been funding education. He had been paying the premium on his mother's death while she was still breathing behind asylum walls. The roar of the furnace intensified. The wooden crate on the conveyor belt jerked forward. Another muffled cry came from inside. Darnell didn't look at the paper anymore. He lunged at Reginald, shoving him aside with a force that sent the older man crashing into a stack of rusted oil drums. Darnell scrambled onto the moving belt. The metal was hot beneath his palms. He kicked at the heavy wooden slats of the crate. "Mom, I'm here," he screamed. His fingers bled as he pried a board loose. He saw a flash of silver hair and a terrified brown eye. With one final, desperate heave, the side of the crate splintered. He reached in and pulled the frail woman out just as the crate tipped into the mouth of the furnace. A blast of heat scorched his back. They tumbled onto the concrete floor, gasping for air. Darnell held her tight. He didn't care about the soot or the grime. He wept into her shoulder, whispering apologies over and over. "I'm sorry. Little Lion is here." "I'm so sorry." The woman didn't pull away. She leaned her head against his chest, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. She reached up and touched the star-shaped scar on his arm, the same one she carried. Reginald stood up slowly, wiping blood from his lip. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was looking at a small, hidden camera mounted on the brick wall. He pulled a remote from his pocket and pressed a button. A red light on the camera turned green. Reginald looked at Darnell and Cora. His voice was cold and hollow. He told Darnell that saving her was the easy part. He said the insurance policy Darnell had been signing wasn't just a scam. It was a confession. And by saving her, Darnell had just triggered a clause that would strip him of his medical license and his entire fortune by dawn. Reginald smiled a jagged, broken smile. He asked Darnell if he was ready to be a beggar alongside the woman he just rescued. Why did saving his mother mean losing his life's work? And what was Reginald still hiding in the asylum records? Darnell stood tall, shielding his mother Cora behind his broad shoulders. He looked at Reginald and didn't see a mentor anymore. He saw a cornered predator. Reginald's thumb hovered over the remote, his eyes fixed on the green light of the camera. The threat was clear. One click and the edited footage would reach the medical board, making Darnell look like an accomplice to insurance fraud. Darnell didn't beg for mercy. He reached into the inner pocket of his soot-stained lab coat and pulled out his phone. He held the screen up so Reginald could see the active recording. He hadn't just been saving his mother, he had been streaming. The janitor's closet, the stairwell conversation, and the roar of the furnace were already being watched by a live audience of thousands. Reginald's jagged smile vanished. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. Darnell stepped forward, his voice low and cold. He told Reginald that the confession clause worked both ways. If Darnell went down, he would take the entire Moore empire with him. Every asylum record, every fake death certificate, and every penny stolen from the Sterling Fund would be exposed in open court. Cora gripped Darnell's arm, her breathing shallow. She pointed a trembling finger at Reginald's heavy gold ring. She whispered that the ring had a hidden compartment. Inside was the microfilm of the original bookstore deed, the one Reginald had burned the building to hide. Reginald lunged for his sedan, but the sound of sirens cut through the roar of the factory. Blue and red lights began to dance against the rusted iron gates. Keisha had arrived, and she wasn't alone. 3 police cruisers skidded to a halt in the yard, officers jumping out with their weapons drawn. Darnell watched as the officers moved toward Reginald. He felt a strange sense of calm. He had lost his career, and his billionaire status might be gone by morning, but he felt lighter than he had in 20 years. He turned to Cora and promised her they would never hide again. But as the police reached Reginald, the old man didn't put his hands up. He threw the locket and the remote into the still glowing mouth of the furnace. He looked at Darnell and said the film was gone. He whispered that without that deed, Cora Vance would still be a ghost in the eyes of the law. Why was Reginald so sure the truth would still burn? And what was Keisha holding in her hand as she ran toward the furnace? The heavy furnace door groaned as Reginald slammed it shut, sealing the locket and the remote inside the inferno. He leaned against the hot steel, laughing a dry, hollow laugh. He told Darnell that a digital stream meant nothing without the physical deed to prove Cora's identity. The police were closing in, but Reginald didn't care. He believed he had burned the only bridge back to the past. But Keisha didn't stop at the furnace. She ran straight to Darnell, sliding to a stop in the soot. She wasn't holding a document. She was holding a small, battery-powered medical scanner. She grabbed Cora's right hand and pressed the device against her palm. A soft blue light flickered over the star-shaped scar. Darnell watched as a series of encrypted files popped up on the scanner's screen. Keisha whispered that the overdose 20 years ago wasn't just a sedative. It was a medical microchip implant used in the Sterling experimental wing. It contained Cora's full biometric history, her DNA, and the original digital scan of the bookstore deed. Reginald had forgotten one thing. Cora Vance wasn't just a woman. She was the primary donor for the very technology that built Darnell's career. The laughter died in Reginald's throat. The police grabbed his arms, forcing him away from the furnace. They stripped the gold ring from his finger. Darnell didn't watch them drag Reginald away. He turned to Cora. He took off his soot-stained lab coat and wrapped it around her thin shoulders. 6 months later, Darnell sat on the porch of a small house with a blue door. It wasn't a mansion, but it was home. He had lost his billionaire title and his hospital board seat, but he was still a doctor who worked at a small community clinic downtown. Cora sat beside him, her silver hair neatly braided. She reached out and touched the star-shaped scar on Darnell's arm. She didn't call him Junior anymore. She called him Darnell. She told him that the fire had finally stopped burning. Darnell looked at the yellow roses growing in the garden. They weren't for a grave anymore. They were for the kitchen table. As the sun set, Darnell noticed a small, unmarked envelope in the mailbox. He opened it and found a single, charred key. There was no note. He looked toward the road, but it was empty. Who was still watching the Sterling family from the shadows? The truth has finally been set free, and Darnell has found the only thing money could never buy, his mother. This story reminds us that while justice can be delayed, the bond of blood is a flame that no one can extinguish. If you believe that a mother's love is the greatest power on earth, hit like and subscribe. What would you do if you discovered the person you trusted most was your greatest enemy? Share your thoughts in the comments below.